I would like to introduce a good friend of ours, and this is Stacy. He's going to be speaking on tactics win battles, logistics win wars. Welcome, Stacy.
Okay. For those of you, can you hear me in the back? Okay. For those that don't know me, I'm Charles Baxley's pet loyalist. And we're going to talk about logistics. This is going to be a whirlwind tour because I originally started off with over 200 slides, and based on Charles' philosophy that shorter is better, it's down to about 25. I want to give you a visual idea on what was involved. We read all about the historians and the big picture, but how did you keep them fed? So that's where we're going to go. Logistics is stuff, if you don't have enough of it, the war will not be won as soon. Nathaniel Greene, our favorite general down south. Oh, it works good. Okay, I'm going to talk about land and then water transportation. Historians always overlook the big picture. I'm sorry, they always look at the big picture, but not the details. I'm a details man. I want to know what they ate, how they wiped their backsides, what were they wearing or not wearing. For me, it's the common soldier. And everything in the war, to get him to be effective, has to be transported. Okay, definition of logistics. The branch of military science dealing with procurement, maintenance, movement of equipment, supplies, and personnel. Basically, moving that from here to there. There we go. I'm going to speak very generally on this because otherwise we're going to end up in the weeds. And we don't want to go there for 45 minutes. Generally speaking, the Crown was the master of logistics. They had a worldwide empire. The American Revolution was part of a world war. They could transport from Ireland all over the world, to India, Africa, to the States. And they supplied everything. Sometimes in the supply depots like Charlestown, there were years worth of supplies. They simply couldn't move them out of the warehouses to get them up country. Generally speaking, the Americans had difficulties in protecting its supply lines from British interdiction. They had a big navy. So you had all the colonies responsible for certain aspects to feed their troops. Now the problem is if you're by the coast, they sent Marines in. That happened in Wilmington and other places further north. They constantly had to move their depots and manufacturing around. Again, because the British Army, not just out looking for forage, but looking to destroy the American ability to wage war. The Northern Campaign, there were a lot of raids down upstate New York where Washington's Northern Army was being supplied from. They devastated the area. It was like locusts coming in and eating everything. They burned all the mills, all the crops, anything they couldn't carry off was destroyed. Washington was terribly worried about this. Now, one of the interesting things, and this is true for the British and the Americans, the officers bought up the wagons. They were speculating, so they were double dipping. Then they would hire teamsters who were paid twice as much as a soldier, who would steal anything that they could. But they were double dipping. So if I'm a British officer, my job is to transport things. I'm going to use my own wagons, and I'm going to pay myself an outrageous fee. And that happened on both sides. And the Americans were always in desperate need of food, clothing, and ammunition. That went on through the entire war. In extreme need, armies comprise of soldiers who need food in their bellies, clothing on their backs, various items of equipment from tents for sheltering to weapons for fighting. Basically what we call today, beans, bullets, and Band-Aids. Those are the basics you need to be in the field. It all had to be manufactured either in the UK, Ireland, or somewhere in the American colonies, or in France. Then it has to be transported. That's the logistics part of it. Now, question. What was the single most requested item demanded by rebel commissaries to be furnished for the benefit of the troops. This includes green. Any ideas?
Rum.
Nope. Barrels.
Little rum.
They're constantly, yeah. Some of the rum was constantly being stolen by the wagoneers. They drill little holes in it, siphon it off, plug it back up, and the barrel gets there half full. And they're quite happy when they deliver it. So just an idea of how many are made per year. 300,000 barrels just in Virginia alone. You can't have anything manufactured that has to be moved without putting it in a barrel. So they're constantly whining, please send the barrels back. Okay, the big picture. What we're going to talk about is you see the first yellow line. That generally represents about 20 to 25 miles from the ocean to the inside. You can get larger ships in on the tidewater for about 20, 25 miles. Then you have to switch it, where you see the broken yellow line behind that, to barges, big plantation barges. These things would be 60 feet long and 30 feet wide sometimes. Great variation in size. From there, you have to go to smaller barges and boats to get it up to places like up the waterway. You could send a large barge up the Savannah River for 3 weeks to get to Augusta. So think in terms of every time you go up one of these creeks, you have to decide on what the weather's going to be, how shallow, where are the rapids, where are the bridges, constantly being interdicted by guys like Marion. So they're sitting there just bushwhacking them as they come by. The green line along the coast represents the Wilmington-Charleston Road. That was the main coastal road. There were only 2 or 3 others, the Great Northern Wagon Road, that went up. So basically, if you're going inland by road, for example, from Charleston to Camden, it's going to take you almost 2 weeks. And you're constantly going to be harassed. That's the nature of it. So you can see the difficulties going up. The red lines are the general river systems. And you can see how far it gets up to the Piedmont, Augusta, the Wateree River system, and I'm skipping on. Oh, and if you're interested in the real battle up for Sullivan's Island for the first siege of Charlestown, I have a great paper on it. What you've read was mostly lies by American authors. Okay, a rough idea of the roads. You've got 3 pictures, and that's roughly what it was going to look like. Only the trees would have been much bigger. But we have various authors that talk about the experiences. Very bad roads, swamps are something particular. And they are full of dangerous serpents, wild beasts harboring in bogs. Holes are dangerous and uncertain. The whole country is unhealthy. That was written by a chap named Joseph Salvador, who had the Jewish company in Charleston for the Battle of Beaufort. It was very easy to get lost. Road signs were rare or inaccurate. It's sort of like being in the UK today. Meandering through the countryside was stony and rooty. Conditions of the roads, the inconvenience paled compared to the possibility of being robbed by gangs of thieves and prowling highwaymen. This was William Drayton in 87, and the Civil War is still going on in the backcountry. So let's keep in mind, it just didn't end with the evacuation of Charleston. It was still going on. Very bad roads, low pine barrens. If you've been up to the battlefield, you get a rough idea what it was like, only the trees would have been much bigger. Most of them, they weren't even wide enough to put a 4-wheeled carriage on it. The Camden, the whole road is rough pine barren, chiefly high and very sandy. The average transport on these roads, if you were lucky, was 20 miles a day. Probably less than that, but that's pretty much where way stations were. This is a fun one. Captured at Camden. Depending on who you read, approximately 400 wagons, carts, etc. were captured by Tarleton. So Tarleton has to go up, and I did the math, crunched it up, 20-mile long chain of carts and wagons. Every time he has to stop a wagon and take a prisoner, he has to have somebody guard them. Basically, he's saying, just go home. The Teamsters are all self-employed. By either side, whoever's got the coin, they're going to work for them. So basically, they're just going to ignore them for as much as they can. And I'm going to give you a good idea of what it looks like. Artillery was taken to Saratoga, 22 ammunition wagons, traveling forges. You get the idea. Now, additional stock, which you rarely read about, are pontoon wagons. They actually had Kosciuszko, the Polish engineer, and when I grew up in Detroit, there was a massive statue of him. No idea who he was until I moved down here. But he decided to use wagons and put pontoons on it. The race for the Dan, the reason the British couldn't catch him, is because they would bring up the pontoons, make a bridge, pull the bridge up, and stay a day or two ahead of the Brits. Armorers' wagons. The weapons weren't interchangeable. Each one has to be custom fixed. Milling wagons. You got grain, you've got corn, Indian corn. You have to grind that stuff up. Engineering wagons. Shovels, pickaxes, pulleys, artillery caissons, and baker's wagons. They actually had traveling baker's wagons. If you come up to the reenactment, there's a chap there who has a traveling oven, and he bakes pureed bread. Really outstanding. I never get a chance to taste it because the line's always too long. Okay, an idea of what the wagons and carts look like. The British carts that they brought in from the UK were very heavy and really weren't designed for the American roads. They weren't high enough because the roads, a lot of times, they just cut the stump off and left it. So the wagon would have to go over the stump in between the ruts. The Conestoga wagon was designed, one, as a boat. It floats, if you see the curvature of it, and also it was much higher. And then carts. The two-wheel carts actually could carry over a ton of stuff. They'd have 1, 2, sometimes 3 horses to them. Now here's a big assortment. You see the pontoon boats up high left for you. Water carts. One thing soldiers never have enough of, even today, is enough fresh water. So that's very important. A traveling forge, shoes for the horses. Weapons have to be manufactured, shovels repaired. You constantly have a blacksmith making everything needed. To the center left, a baker's wagon. A mobile kitchen for baking bread. Brilliant. The gunsmith's tent, really big crates, every weapon that breaks down, and at any given time, 17 to 20% of the weapons were non-functional. Much higher with weapons. For the artillery, you have ammunition, but also spare cartridges for the infantry. That was all carried in the artillery carts. You see more wagons, more carts. At the bottom is a 2-horse cart, or 1 horse on the cart, 2 wheels, with a canoe on it, or a bateau. You saw those mostly up north. And then the one with the horse kicking, you can see the barrels lined up on this dray. This is just to give you a running idea of all the different rolling stock. Here's some period artwork showing what it was like. The upper left hand is a British wagon, and that has casualties for the Battle of Germantown, and those are British. The other one is more Napoleonic, but you see how big that wagon is. It could carry up to 3 to 4 tons of equipment and weight. Another cart from 1777, I can't remember which battle it was, but it shows, again, British casualties with 2 donkeys pulling the dray. And then the bottom one was a Sandby drawing, again showing the carts. Now, how do you pull these things? The livestock. Mostly horses. I'm not an equestrian. I've had horses. I know how to ride, and I stay away from horses now because they're dangerous. Normally, a horse will walk 3 to 4 miles an hour. He can do that for 30, 40 miles. Ask General Gates. Typical horse laden can go about 15 to 20 miles. A lot of times, horses were used to carry equipment. With the race at Dan, when the British burned all their heavy rolling stock, things went on the pack horses. Now a horse, for forage, consumes between 50 and 20 pounds of hay per day. Now you get to the fall, when all the forage is gone, there's no more feed for the animals. The animals are basically starving to death, and they're being eaten. If you look at the various probate records when they talk about the livestock, 1780-81, there was hardly any livestock that wasn't in one army or the other. They were all commandeered, and they also died quickly. Now for water, that's not a problem inland where you have a lot of fresh water, but a horse has to have a lot of water. Livestock does. Now the average horse can pull 3 times its body weight. Draft horses, obviously more, but there weren't very many draft horses in the colonies. Now oxen, these things I've been around, they're very moody. They walk about 2 miles an hour. You cannot speed them up. They have a mind of their own. They're sort of like big cats. If you try to push them, they will just stop. And they'll just sit down. They won't move. They can pull their own body weight, which is what makes them so useful. And with multiple teams, they can pull thousands of pounds. Think in terms of pulling giant stumps out of the ground, hauling big logs. I mean, these things were built to move things. But when you hook them up to wagons, they're going to walk at a very slow pace. So now, with a long column of wagons and rolling stock, you've got a combination of horses, oxen and horses hooked up to the same rolling stock. Imagine how that's going to accordion in and out as it goes. For those of you in the military, you know when you're going along marches, it starts spreading out, then it collapses, you stop, then you go. Imagine 20 miles of this. Okay, water. If it works, why reinvent it? The barge up in the upper left is actually Roman. It's the exact same style of barge here in the colonies. And then, of course, our Viking vessels. I threw that in there because they were famous for going up waterways. If they had to, they would portage, take it out of the water, put it on rollers, and scoot it to the next place where there's fresh water or deeper water. Okay, flatboats and barges on the average were about 60 feet long. They could carry up to, some of them, 60 tons. That's an amazing amount of cargo, the really big ones. And you saw those along the coast called plantation barges. You got to move the stuff. Roads really suck. You got to move them by water. Now, one of the fun things with doing the research on this is there was so much information, I just had to cut it out. If you go down to different types of boats, these are all local names for sailboats, barges, scallops, sloops. Half these names you can't even find on the computer, which I thought was amazing. But that was all local dialect. I mentioned Kikusko. He had special boats, barges made, carried out wagons, and they would ford, also the Conestoga wagons. In Charlestown, at any given time, there were 75 flatboats moving cargo around in and out of the coastal areas. The first battle for Sullivan's Island, first attack on Charlestown, the British had 15 prefabricated flatboats. So they took them off, put them all together, and according to the Americans, they sailed across the breach inlet, mowed down by Thompson's riflemen. Blood in the scuppers. Lies. Never happened. They never left the beach. Here's a variety of type of sloops that you would see coming inland for that first 20 to 25 miles with the sails. Then you start going to barges. You can see the size of these barges. And of course, it's going to vary considerably. I just want to give you an idea of what you're looking at. Water transportation. The British, with a big navy, could land anywhere they felt like it. Classic Wilmington. So the barges you can see in the lower right, All the carts on the barge. These barges could hold up to 80 men. They could hold 2 or 3 wagons, depending on the size. Here's some close-ups. For those of you who are Marines or were in the Army and landing in the Pacific, notice the gate. That thing drops down when you get to the shore. They drop that and everybody runs off. And then they form up on the beach and do their thing. They were highly trained as Marines. There was all sorts of documents specifically outlined what happens when you hit the beach, how do you form up in the face of an enemy. These are smaller boats, especially from up north, but you see them down here. You can see the number of troops in them. Some had cannons on the front, big cannons. Ferrying, obviously with all the rivers and creeks here, ferrying. I think Charles mentioned that there was a ferry operating when he was young, back about 1800. And you can see how much cargo they could carry. Now, that didn't get in the way of water navigation as where bridges would. Barge crossing. These are some famous paintings of various barges. You can see Washington doing his thing, standing up in the bow. I don't think he did that because he'd probably get sick. Carrying artillery. And then you have Marion on the bottom. Funny, they all look like the same painting to me. Small river craft. These little things up north, we call them bateaus. You could go through very shallow water with it. You get to a rapid or a falls, pick the thing up, carry it over, drop it back down, and keep going. Upcountry craft. From the big barges, you have to scale down because the water isn't deep enough. So here's examples of smaller craft that you would use mostly by poling. A lot of times they would walk, just like with canals, you had a pathway where you would have a critter, a horse, or manpower literally dragging it up the current. Here's our pontoon wagons. The one on the upper left is actually from the Civil War, or like I like to call it, the War of Northern Aggression. You can see the pontoon wagons, how they were designed. And that's a model of one that's probably closer to what it would have looked like during the American Rebellion. Now, bridges, race to the dam. You put the pontoons in, you throw the lumber down it, you scoot across, you pick it up. They could do that very quickly. They could do this within hours, depending on how big the river was, how deep it was. These engineers were highly skilled at doing this. And then the lower left, that's the Persians at Marathon. So this technology was nothing new. And to end it up, having been a Marine, I was used to being on a landing craft, and compare it to the period landing craft, basically, you can't mess with success. Any questions? Charles.
Kim, I did, as a child, ride a ferry.
I thought I remembered
One's
that.
still operating in South Carolina, and I'll tell you where it is sometime so you can go ride it. I always heard that the British made a strategic mistake thinking that they could supply their armies in the field in North America from local production. But that turned out to be wrong, and so they had to basically put everything in barrels in England, food-wise, to supply those armies, ship it over here to Charleston, then ship it up the rivers and on barrels,
Right.
on wagons and what have you. Have you found any documentation of that hypothesis about the British believing that they could support their armies off the local land?
It follows in the close heels of how many loyalists would support the crown down here in the south. And basically everything was shipped to Ireland and then transshipped to the Atlantic to places like Wilmington, Charleston, Boston, Newport, and rotted in the warehouses because they underestimated the logistics of it, how distant it was. and the population, how much food they could produce, was considerably lower than being produced in the UK. The UK farmers could produce 3 times as much as your small farmer here in the colonies, because they were small. You had the big plantations with a lot of slave labor, but your average farmer simply was subsistence level. And there wasn't enough fodder really to keep the troops in the field, so everything had to be shipped in. And there's a lot of spoilage. I could regale you with all sorts of fun names and some not fit for female company. And so that was pretty common, but there simply wasn't enough available. Now up north in upstate New York, yes, they were producing enough to feed Washington's Northern Army. And when the British came down from Canada with raids for about 4 years, Washington was seriously worried about having to disband his army. That's how bad it got, because the Americans had to live off the land. Other questions? Sir?
Regarding the oxen, you mentioned basically it's a one-way and no way to pass. So you mentioned about the oxen.
Yes.
Who were get tired or decide didn't want to move. They sit down. How are they really, if you had this mile or 2 mile convoy coming, how do they ever get them anywhere if they're doing every other option?
That's, even today with modern convoys, you can only go as fast as the slowest vehicle. And with that, the roads are so narrow you can't bypass, especially if there's swamps on either side. Basically, the whole column is just plodding along at 2-3 miles an hour. The only good thing about the oxen, if you got mad enough, you could eat him. But yeah, it's with the horses, ideally you have 4 horses for a large wagon. The reality was 2 because they didn't have enough livestock. Carts were designed for 2 to 3 horses. Usually it was just 1 horse. Again, they didn't have the livestock to pull them. But yeah, you go as slow as the slowest vehicle is going to go, especially down here. Up north, the roads were bigger. You had open fields that were well developed. Yeah, you could pull them aside, move at different speeds. But for Gates's army, they just plodded along and still couldn't keep their people fed. And that was one of the reasons. Yes, ma'am?
It would appear that the British had a disadvantage in moving equipment and all, because they were having to go upriver. But when Nathaniel Greene came down here, his supplies were coming downriver.
Yes.
And without a motor, I would think that would be a disadvantage to the British.
Yeah, you'd have to pull up or drag them upstream. Greene's army, you've got the current with it, but the problem with Greene is you had all supplies coming from Connecticut, Massachusetts, all through the mountains to come down. Imagine what that's going to be like and how slow it's going to be. And the colonies were never fulfilling their quotas. So Greene had to bring all that. He was a master of logistics. So he's got to bring all this stuff from the interior. Then when he gets to navigable waters, now he's got to build or find the boats. So that was always a problem. Stealing boats, sinking the boats. There were never enough boats. But the barges, the pontoons, that was brilliant. Sir?
Okay, with the American colonies who come under a confederation of states, and each state responsible for supplying their own troops, what was that impact on the overall logistics for supporting the Continental Army as a whole?
Poor. Real poor. Again, they never made their quotas. A lot of times, it looks like, from my point of view, they purposely drug their feet. There was a lot of corruption involved with it. And you have to, the British think in terms of they control the entire coast. So everything has to go inland and then north or south from there, from wherever the depots and magazines are. And they have to be diversified. So you have to bring all these things together in a timely manner, and it's damn near impossible to do. So the American armies were always short of everything. Constantly. JD.
Yeah, excellent presentation. I don't know how you cut it down from 200 slides to what you did, but it's excellent. Thank you, thank you, thank you. A couple of points to make for the audience just to add to what he had to say is that Nathaniel Green was a logistician, and that was his forte. And when he came down here, he had a severe need for barrels, as Kim mentioned. But what most people don't know is that what they filled the barrels with included just about anything, including fresh pork. And you're like, how the heck do they keep pork for a very long time in barrels? But they did. They also did beef in limited quantity, but the other biggest item was rice. The American Army basically lived on a cup of rice a day. That was what they were allocated. So imagine all these men moving around, and they're pulling these barrels of rice and pork and beef and what have you, and they're running out of the barrels. The second point I want to make is that what Kim described was the 1780s, 1770s part of logistics. There was no mechanized army like we have today. The mechanized army includes tanks and cars and jeeps. So logistics now includes sparing. How many spares do I need to bring around with me? In the old days, the spares would have done a horse. Or maybe one more barrel. But anyway, modern logistics is a little more complicated than it was then, but it's fascinating, and the armies and Marines all lived because of it. Thank you, Kim. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Gordon, do you have questions?
You know,
Here.
in the modern army, I understand.
There's a microphone you can get.
I'm right behind you.
In the modern army today, I understand to keep one combat soldier supplied and fed takes about 8 to 9 logistics.
Yes.
What would it be in an 18th century context? Do we have a sense?
I have a sense of it. John Rees, brilliant historian, has done a lot of work on this. You can read his essays on Scrib on the computer. They're downloaded for free. During World War II, it was 13 people wagging the tail. During Vietnam, it was probably the same. During this period, especially for the Brits, probably 10. Because you didn't have the mass manufacturing apparatus, although they did have a large manufacturing capacity. For the Americans, because it was so diversified, 8, 9, 10. You know, I've not yet seen any really good guesswork on that. It's really hard to say. Other questions? Sir?
Just to follow up on that one, the number 10, 12, 13 that you're talking about, is that you actually make or, well, like raise food or manufacture a part in addition to the people that are acquiring them and getting them to the front?
Yeah, like for example, during World War II, that would include people making ammunition, boxing up the food, getting it on board ships, the stevedores, landing it, transporting it. So that was roughly 13 to 1. Today, a little bit less, I would think, because of modernization of computers. You don't need all the paperwork that you would have needed. In the colonies, because it was so diversified, again, I couldn't give you an honest guess. I can give you a wild-ass guess, but that's about the best that I can do based on my research.
Can we have 2 questions back here?
Who's hers?
Hey.
Oh, yes, sir.
So, a question, or comment and question. When I went through CNGS, they said it was 6 soldiers to one rifleman. 69 to 1 rifleman.
That's for today?
That was for 20 years ago.
Okay, yeah, it's probably still the same.
But that would not include manufacturing goods, okay? That's just in the military. During the Revolutionary War, they did not have the dedicated people who were the division support commands. They didn't have anything like that. Everybody was an infantryman, and maybe as an additional duty, you did something else. They didn't have any medical people except for the surgeon. the bandsmen would collect the wounded. And everything was very haphazard when it came to supporting the soldier in the field. Women did a lot of that work in supporting the soldiers, making uniforms and such. It was not part of the Army per se. A lot of that was done by civilians, and that was very haphazard, which caused some problems for the soldiers in the field and continuity of supply. And as you said, it was very, very corrupt, both in England and in colonies. The question I had, though, was you mentioned mules. Were mules not around at that time, or they just didn't use them?
I don't think there were that many mules. It's been a while since I've looked at probate records. I think you did some research on that before. I just have not seen much in the way of documentation on mules. Obviously, they were here. They would have been used, but I just haven't seen much information on them. Sir?
Real quick one question. It brings to mind the movie The Patriot. In the Patriot movie, it comes back to my mind, you see the people being burned in a church. Now, I hear it didn't actually happen in America, but it actually happened in Europe. Were the British so cruel they would burn people in the church, or do you think this happened or not? I'm just wondering if you have...
Well, that's a little bit outside my
He's talking
presentation.
logistics, but to answer your question, that was Bloody Bill Cunningham who did it.
Oh.
So, no, it's not British cruelty, though. If you want to talk about Major Reed burning everyone's house, yes. If you want to talk about General Cornwallis burning every plantation on his march from the Carolinas up into Williamsburg, yes. The actual burning of people in the church, that was Bloody Bill. So Americans being cruel to Americans.
Sad.
One thing I want to say about the movie The Patriot, if that gets somebody interested in reading a book or watching a video on YouTube, great. It was entertaining, but why let history get in the way of a good story? Somebody else have a question?
Any other questions? Oh, hi. Wasn't it Phil Donahue that used to run down the...
Yes.
Aren't you impressed? I know who that is.
Jerry Springer.
I know Jerry Springer.
I know that during the war, the Continental Congress, Provincial Congress in South Carolina, took over the ferries to transport the troops. And I know at Grandy that happened. And because of that, the British wanted to fight in that area to reclaim that, the ferries. So,
That doesn't surprise me. One of the things that most people don't pay any attention to, especially in Georgia, every ferry was fortified. There were redoubts, and one side would leave, the other side would come in, and they'd switch sides. They would also burn the ferries to stop, the other side from using them. Forts were commonly fortified, not big, stone fortifications or big houses, but just earthenworks that were easy to maintain. You could throw up a redoubt, for example, on Breed's Hill, Bunker Hill. The redoubt was square, 132 feet square, went up in 4 hours. So you can do that quickly. There were some chaps in England that I knew, reenactors. 25 of them threw up two-sided redoubt in 4 hours. So just like the Romans, you march all day, you stop, and you dig in. I mean, we still do the same thing today. When I was a young infantryman, before the D's back gave out, you stop, you dig a hole. It's the same concept.
Great question. Thank you, Kim. And I think that we should bring back the baker's wagons.
Come to the meeting after. You'll be there this year.
Oh, by the way, I have had his provisions. And Camden, the gentleman who brings the stove,
Yes.
they're worth standing in line,
Yeah.
period. They're
And he uses
amazing.
lard instead of butter.
And tallow.
Yeah.
It was good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.